Housing is ultimately just another private good, excludable and rival like cell phones or apples. It does have some peculiar properties, and the machinations and results of the housing market are more visible in the structure of cities and regions, but we are ultimately talking about an economic process here. Contrast that with the policies around public goods like national defense, tax policy, which is mostly concerned with efficiency, redistributive policies that are about considerations of social justice, or criminal policy, which to some extent tries to correspond to common sense notions of what should be done with criminals, therefore intrinsically depending on non-utilitarian considerations. For the housing market, location decisions within and between cities are sensitive to the costs and benefits of such decisions. It's like choosing a job or picking a product in the grocery store. Individuals choose a combination of housing and other consumption that maximizes their utility given their income and the price of housing. A primary determinant of location choice is job accessibility. Households are willing to pay more for housing in locations with lower commuting costs, but location decisions also incorporate neighborhood characteristics which are priced into housing prices. These include crime rates, environmental quality, school performance, or the composition of the neighborhood, since households often prefer neighbors with similar preferences for public goods, leading to sorting by income, education, and race. Housing serves as both a consumption good, providing shelter, and an investment good, generating wealth. Housing is a durable good, capable of providing services for many decades. The housing stock is heterogeneous, varying in size, layout, design, and location, and this leads to submarkets. There is no one housing market. Due to consumer substitution, housing price increases accelerate as you move closer to the city center. When accessibility increases or commuting cost decreases, the price of housing rises by more than the direct commuting savings because consumers respond by consuming less housing. A larger price increase is then needed to achieve location equilibrium, where no household has an incentive to change location. With two people and two houses, one desirable and one not, the price of the desirable house needs to adjust upwards until both people agree that they are indifferent between living in either place. Why even have a housing policy then? We don't have a cell phone policy or a garden hose policy, since market mechanisms efficiently allocate these private goods to those who value them most, thus getting the entire economy to the Pareto frontier. I'm not just bringing this up to immediately lock it down again. This is a fair point, and a completely unregulated housing market would not be a horrible institutional arrangement, unlike an unregulated environment or national defense. Justifications for government intervention can be fixing market failures or achieving redistributive ends, and both are invoked when it comes to housing. Especially high-density housing can impose costs on neighbors, such as increased road traffic, noise, congestion, parking problems, sanitation, and obstruction of use or sunlight. These are not typically accounted for in market prices. Density also causes positive externalities. Firms and consumers cluster in cities to share local public goods or benefit from external economies of scale, for example, labor pooling or knowledge spillover. Secondly, we have an interest in providing the poor with shelter, the same way we have an interest in providing them with food. People make better and worse arguments for why the market supposedly fails to properly supply housing. Some of them aren't actually market failures. Bad arguments include the following three. The dual nature of housing is a consumption and investment good. Neither consumption goods nor financial assets need to be regulated the way housing is. To the extent that housing is an asset, it should be regulated like it, which does not include, for example, zoning. Also, what about direct equivalents like luxury watches, old cars, or various art collector pieces? They aren't and shouldn't be regulated like housing. Secondly, there is the argument that everyone needs housing. It is a social or human right. The same is true for food and clothes, which are less regulated than housing. Questions of securing a basic standard of living are better solved via direct monetary transfers than in-kind benefits, supply restrictions, or price controls. There is the argument about promoting home ownership. Policies aim to increase home ownership rates, often based on perceived positive externalities, greater investment in society or more stable neighborhoods, or as a means of wealth accumulation. It's questionable to me whether those positive externalities even obtain at all. Does buying rather than renting a home actually cause your psychology to change? I suspect strong selection effects of people who care more about their neighborhoods being more likely to buy homes in the first place. Encouraging the accumulation of wealth through housing makes as much sense as encouraging people to buy expensive watches for this end. If inducing people to save is a policy goal, a law that simply requires them to put a certain amount of income into approved ETFs or similar would be more rational. Then there are three intermediate arguments. There are exclusionary practices, not so much what people complain about when they say gentrification, since that is just a euphemism for market forces, but for example racist discrimination in simply not selling or renting to black people may run counter to policy goals of creating mixed neighborhoods. Insofar as this is in fact a policy goal, different options to accomplish them should be evaluated via cost-benefit analysis like any other policy, and potentially none of them are worth it. This talking point often seems to me to have more of a post-hoc rationalization flavor. The actual policy goal is making minorities or poor people better off, and for unrelated reasons, people believe rent control or zoning will accomplish this. In a third step then, because the actual goal is unpopular, the proponents outwardly and even inwardly, through changes caused by cognitive dissonance reduction of professing this belief, adopt the position of trying to create mixed neighborhoods, arguing that such diversity is intrinsically rather than instrumentally desirable, not on grounds of more innovation or less crime, for example, which other policies would accomplish more efficiently. I doubt many people actually believe this. Insofar as positive beliefs about diversity are based on rational deliberation, it is that people believe diversity will cause good outcomes. More importantly, positions on diversity are probably not based on rational deliberation at all for anyone involved, either for or against. But to the extent that people do have these preferences, zoning regulations or similar are not on their face rational, since there are no rational preferences. There is no arguing about taste. And policymakers need to take their citizens' preferences as they are, not as they might be, which includes both woke and racist preferences regarding zoning restrictions. Secondly, there is historical preservation. Intuitively, we may want to zone historical centers to prevent skyscrapers in Venice and single-family homes within Central Park. To the extent that this preserves public goods, the experience itself of walking through Venice or the Central Park would be the public good. That might make sense for similar reasons that preserving pieces of art for future generations can make sense. But there is a difficult balance to strike. We may be preventing the creation of what would have turned into historic centers. Would current historic centers have been prevented by zoning had it existed at the time? Or the benefit of what we are preventing could turn out to be so large that we should be willing to sacrifice historical memory for it. There is also the question of how much new buildings would actually destroy these centers. Did the Eiffel Tower destroy Paris? Would the contrast between a modern cement and glass building next to historic facades detract from or add to the experience? Thirdly, there are incomplete markets. Maybe some people would move into a neighborhood if there were jobs, and employers would move into that neighborhood if there were more people. While this kind of coordination problem could in theory be solved by government intervention, it's not clear to me what information government agencies may have that the employers and potential movers are missing. In any case, this is an argument for more building again. But there are also some good arguments for government intervention in the housing market. The market is slow to adjust. In the long run, supply is elastic. In the short run, it is vertical over a certain quantity. It is simply impossible to snap your fingers and immediately conjure up newly built housing. So the housing market will be in potentially inefficient disequilibrium for longer. There are negative externalities. New construction can lead to increased congestion on roads, noise, and reduced air quality, imposing costs on existing residents. These externalities can and should be priced in via the price of new housing through regulations that impose costs on developers and buyers. There are positive externalities too. Higher proximity to jobs, schools, and recreation will reduce travel time. But this higher proximity to jobs and club-like services, for example cinemas, theaters, or museums, is fully internalized via lower wages and higher fees. But unless schools, parks, and playgrounds can charge money, some positive externalities remain. This is an argument for building more housing around these publicly accessible goods, having subsidies or lower regulatory hurdles, and zoning for parks. Few would argue that zoning Central Park into residential housing would make the world better off in total, rather than introducing rent control or zoning for single-family housing or height restrictions. More complicatedly, there is asymmetric information in the housing market. There is asymmetric information both about the quality of the product and of the consumer. How safe is it to live in this particular house, and will the power suddenly go out because the electricians were not thorough enough? This risk is opaque to potential consumers. Theoretically, the private market could ameliorate this via rating agencies, or the government could produce that service through its own agencies. But in reality, there are regulatory building codes that governments oversee and courts enforce in case of damages. Even this could be done privately by contractual agreements, as long as courts exist that can enforce them. Deciding between these options should be done by cost-benefit analysis and will depend on the particular efficiency of private markets and the actual government agencies in place. But this type of regulation is not on its face inefficient. Secondly, landlords renting housing to potential tenants face a similar asymmetric information problem as buyers in the used car market. Will this guy trash the place? In a world with stronger tenant protection laws, will he pay me on time and spare me the opportunity cost associated with evicting and suing him? If courts can clearly determine the damage and opportunity cost, the only cost associated with tenants trashing rented houses would be the cost of insurance in case the court cannot get enough money from the unruly tenant. In reality, the cost is also in the risk of not getting all the costs covered by court judgment. Even if the expected value of the judgment is the correct amount, risk-averse landlords would still face an uncompensated utility loss. In some colloquial sense, it may be quote-unquote dumb to be risk-averse regarding sums this small, but there is no arguing about taste, which is all risk aversion is at the end of the day. The solution people choose in reality is to require collateral. When you rent money from the bank to buy a house, meaning taking out a mortgage, they will ask you to put up money, and similarly, landlords will ask for some month's rent up front. The correct regulatory response here, again, is not zoning or rent control, but compelling information provision. The SEC makes sure that certain companies regularly reveal truthful information about themselves, and similarly, the government may require tenants to reveal truthful information like credit scores or criminal history to landlords. This could also be done privately, as it is for financial loans. Banks act as impersonal intermediaries between lenders and borrowers, in a sense certifying borrowers' credit risk. Really, it is the bank making loans to borrowers they screened and taking on the lender's money into unrelated steps. Just because the market is not very well able to deal with the provision of a good does not mean the government will be any better. There are government failures the same way there are market failures. Take historical preservation on grounds of public good provision. Government decisions about which sites to protect may reflect political bargaining, symbolic gestures, or lobbying by well-connected interests rather than any weighing of costs and benefits. The political process aggregates preferences through voting, negotiation, interest group pressure, and may be myopic and thus need not produce outcomes that maximize social welfare. In some cases, political incentives can even exacerbate inefficiencies, for example by directing resources towards highly visible but low-impact projects that appeal to voters or donors. This holds even for the point about disequilibrium. For example, a short-term rent control combined with measures to boost supply could ease the path to the new equilibrium when there is a sudden price shock. But government officials may face incentives to keep the rent control around for longer because current occupants like the policy, and potential occupants from outside the city may not be able to vote in the elections that officials run in. This is not to mention that the officials may simply lack information or talent to choose the appropriate measures. Trying to dampen the negative effects of short-term disequilibrium with government intervention may be going from the frying pan into the fire. Many of the externalities from housing, both positive and negative, are local in nature, noise, shading, or strain on local services. These effects can, in principle, be internalized through local property taxation or similar mechanisms that capture land value changes without the need for more distortionary interventions, like blanket zoning restrictions. But while a uniform citywide property tax could be set at a level that reflects the average marginal social cost of new development, its ability to properly internalize the externalities, such as congestion or air pollution, of each individual housing unit is limited. These harms are typically nonlinear, rising sharply once local capacity constraints are reached, spatially concentrated in specific neighborhoods or transport corridors, and borne disproportionately by nearby residents. A broad tax thus risks either overcharging developments with minimal marginal impact or undercharging those in already strained locations, while distributing revenues too widely to meaningfully compensate the most affected. More targeted instruments, such as congestion pricing or emissions-based building requirements, generally align the price signal more closely with the actual pattern of external costs. Ideally, emissions would be just handled by a global CO2 tax or a cap-and-trade regime, but cities need to make policies for the reality that they actually exist in, not the one that we would like to exist in. And finally, asymmetric information is basically already handled well by existing regulations like the ones mentioned. Mandatory seller disclosures, building codes, periodic inspections, and professional licensing for agents are designed to reduce bias informational disadvantage, while title registration systems secure ownership claims and reduce transaction risks. In mature markets with strong institutions, these tools mitigate much of the worst asymmetry, and outright fraud or hidden defects are rarer than in less regulated systems. Critics and reformers of the status quo argue for more standardized verifiable building conditions reports at the point of sale, potentially coupled with digital property records that track maintenance and repair history over time. The idea of a property passport, already piloted in some EU countries, is one example of a proposed reform aiming at making housing quality more transparent and reducing the residual scope for opportunistic misrepresentation. One might ask whether preventing racist discrimination, in this context at least, is desirable at all. Discrimination mediated by economic factors, for example racist employers refusing to hire black people, will be alleviated by market forces, since workers earn their marginal products. You would need society-wide oligopolistic collusion between employers to enforce below market rate wages for minorities, and oligopolies are intrinsically unstable. This does not apply to racism not affected by market forces, like government regulation of course. Secondly, if people want to make contracts not to sell or rent houses in their neighborhoods to certain people, this may be acceptable on grounds of liberalism, even overriding cost-benefit considerations, which I'm not convinced would come down on the side of government regulation against such practices. This may become immediately clear if we are not talking about racial minorities, but viewpoint minorities, like white supremacists, whom people might feel inclined to exclude from their neighborhoods. How about poor people? Redistribution is justified even on purely utilitarian, hard-nosed economic grounds because of the diminishing marginal utility of money, if we allow preferences to be compared, which is clearly what everyone actually believes. Providing them affordable housing could be done in 3 different ways: subsidizing supply, developers and public housing, subsidizing demand, giving money to poor people via housing vouchers, or price controls for existing units, meaning rent control. All of these have their own inefficiency costs I'll spell out along the way, but I'd like to repeat that subsidizing housing does not prima facie make more sense than subsidizing cell phones. The government puts money to various uses that make it cheaper to build houses. A government agency may spend some money collected via taxation on buying existing housing or hiring people to build new houses. This direct government provision of housing is usually called social or public housing. There are also regular subsidies for building new housing. Paying people some money for building, maybe with strings attached, like that the costs per unit cannot exceed some amount. And if they do, you lose the subsidy. This will drive a wedge between supply and demand, increasing the price received by producers and lowering the price faced by consumers. The lower price for consumers improves affordability, but it also means the marginal housing unit not receiving the subsidy is no longer profitable and will be retired. 100 new subsidized units may in reality end up being around 50 net new dwellings. A benefit of subsidizing supply is that it can be done via tax benefits. The government in some way reduces the tax burden on companies engaged in building housing, again maybe strings attached for what kind of housing, so that no inefficient tax to raise the money for the subsidy is necessary. A problem of subsidizing supply is that the actual political process to allocate the subsidy is more fragile than for subsidizing demand. What are the criteria by which an agency distributes the subsidy to producers? This decision will be lobbied by interest groups, and the criteria may end up including vague environmental goals that have nothing to do with affordability, for example benefits for including a solar panel somewhere, and companies end up with unproductive panels in a corner somewhere. Could be DEI-related checkboxes, like having people of color in the leadership of the construction business, or carve-outs for local materials that actually benefit some local companies that lobbied for this inclusion. Better organized groups are better able to acquire benefits. The US spends almost $100 billion on tax breaks for mortgage interest payments. This is about double the cost of vouchers, tax credits to low-income housing, and public housing combined, and accrues mostly to higher-income individuals. The subsidy also grows with higher mortgages, meaning richer families receive larger subsidies because of their larger mortgages. In reality, this mix of lobbying, distorted input use, and also excess profits makes subsidizing supply less efficient than subsidizing demand. In the US, you can supply about 50% more people with equally good housing when using vouchers than when using public housing or tax credits for developers. Direct government production also increases total supply and therefore lowers costs of housing to everyone, not just those who ultimately live in the new units, which is what vouchers do. The problem is that governments empirically are substantially less efficient at producing housing than the market, measured in price per square foot or per square meter. A ballpark number is that providing a housing benefit to someone via public housing is about twice as expensive as comparable private housing, in the US at least. Apart from this very obvious inefficiency, the taxes needed to raise the money for the construction cause an inefficiency, and then there is the opportunity cost of not putting the raised money into the next best use, be that cancer research or a golden toilet for the White House and so forth. Actual execution can be problematic too. If receiving access to social housing is regulated by a waiting list, this will make moving to another location to take a higher paying job unattractive, since it would put you at the bottom of the waiting list again. The implicit cost of moving are then increased by the size of the housing benefit, and more generally, building houses in a particular area, like subsidizing supply of housing in a particular area, will limit poor people to live in that area. The government will means test who can rent these housing units by requiring proof of income, but if these checks are done infrequently, This may lead to misoccupancy, non-poor people taking up a social housing place instead of a poor person. For example, in Germany, this check is done only once at the beginning. In general, subsidizing supply has worse optics than subsidizing demand because it means paying a smaller number of construction companies large amounts of money rather than a large number of people small amounts of money. Subsidizing demand just means giving people some amount of money to be spent on housing. That could be a simple cash transfer, enabling poor people to allocate the new money as they see fit, presumably some of that going to buy shelter. Or it could be so-called vouchers, which are like food stamps but for housing, meaning money that can only be spent on housing. This approach is not trying to enable poor people to buy housing by affecting the market equilibrium like subsidizing supply, and yet it will affect the market. The demand curve will shift right, and the equilibrium will slide along the upward sloping supply curve, increasing the price of housing. In the long run, this higher price will induce more housing to be built, which you can see by looking at the x-axis. But unless the long-run supply curve is literally horizontal, the price will still increase by some amount. Since vouchers thus drive up the price of housing, individuals who don't receive the vouchers are made worse off. Perversely enough, especially the price of low-quality housing is affected, making the situation for poor people who do not get vouchers worse, but this trickles upwards as well. Subsidizing demand is therefore in part redistribution within a local real estate market, say within a city, from voucher non-recipients to voucher recipients. A problem with vouchers and similar means-tested programs is that they impose an implicit tax on recipients, since their benefits will phase out or, worse, disappear at once when the recipient's income increases. But I'd like to repeat that vouchers in reality are noticeably more efficient at providing people with housing than public housing and supply-side measures in general. The empirical results on bad work incentives are also ambiguous. They may increase productivity enough to have net zero effect. Vouchers also give the recipients more freedom regarding location decisions, since they are not limited to the area where public or subsidized housing is built. Vouchers, or even better simple cash transfers to poor people, should be the policy tool of choice to achieve affordable housing. While vouchers redistribute locally, either subsidy will be a redistribution from all taxpayers in the country, if the subsidies are funded federally at least, to recipients of vouchers or subsidized housing. Whether these distributive effects are good or bad is a question of values, but the tax is needed to raise the money to finance either of these programs is imposing an unambiguous inefficiency. The benefits of any subsidy will be split between suppliers and demanders according to their elasticities. The elasticities of supply and demand are roughly, but not exactly, the slopes of these curves. Who gets the literal check from the government is irrelevant economically. In the short run, supply of housing is completely inelastic, since it takes time to build new housing and the entire benefit is absorbed by suppliers of housing, similar to what is shown in this diagram. In the long run, demand is more inelastic and tenants and buyers benefit most. There's no way to make sure the price of any housing built is going to be accessible to low-income individuals, since being cheap is not a quality like room number or ceiling height that can be chosen at will. If the government builds a new house and sells it on the market, hoping it will go to a poor person, it may have underestimated how desirable that new unit is, and the price will be bid up high. If the government wants to make sure a particular housing unit is affordable to poor people, rather than just aiming to provide some housing units to poor people, it will have to do A, rent control, either limiting what the private landlords can charge or limiting what the government itself charges if the unit is under its control, or B, allow only a certain type of tenant to rent the unit by means testing. This would require proof of being the correct type. This is usually done for social housing, so I'll just refer to that discussion earlier. Rent control is so obviously brain dead that it appears in economics textbooks only as a cautionary tale, or to give an example of the effects of price ceilings. While I'll spell the costs out here, this is not a proposal that should be taken seriously by anyone. When a regulator declares it illegal for you to pay more than some amount for rent, this will diminish the return on all housing units affected by the price ceiling. Producers of housing will then divert their capital from the lowest return units to other uses in the economy. Simple stocks would be an easy example, meaning they will stop maintaining those low return units until their costs justify their lower returns, or they are driven off of the market. Rental units may be turned into sold units or non-residential rental instead, and no new units like that will be built. High return units will of course still be built as long as there is no other investment with higher returns. Thus initially, rent control is actually effective at reducing the costs to tenants. It is in the long run that the stock of housing decays to a lower level as more and more housing units leave the market. The theoretical price increases, but this won't be paid in money, since that is illegal, but in time. In gas shortages or the Soviet Union, people wait in physical lines to acquire gas or or bread. In housing shortages caused by rent control, people wait in metaphorical lines for housing units to be freed up. Time isn't free, but valued at the hourly wage, so people will quote-unquote wait in line until the monetary price plus the waiting price exceeds the value they derive from the good they are waiting for. So far, so unproblematic. Maybe waiting is more egalitarian and we care about egalitarianism. But the problem is that all of this cost simply evaporates and goes to no one. Everyone simply gets a little poorer. If resource allocations are made via willingness to pay, the money actually goes to someone, namely the seller, making the process less wasteful. The same is true for search costs. Being first now pays, so people will waste time on being on the lookout for newly freed up units and being the first to call or be physically present. In general, resources will be misallocated. Housing units do not go to those who value them most, and people who already have rent-controlled units will hold on to them long after there are other people who would value them much more, because those current owners do not have to face the market price that reflects this higher valuation. The policy tools outlined above aim at housing affordability, but we are not talking about enabling people to buy housing that were literally unable to afford it before. Severe affordability issues obtain already when people spend more than half their income on housing. But at the limit, this does turn into homelessness. The economic problems are low income and relatively high prices for low quality housing in particular. The price of luxury condos is not directly relevant to homeless people. Low institutionalization rates for the mentally ill will also drive up homelessness numbers. Measures that improve the function of low-skill labor markets and low-quality housing markets and simplifying institutionalization would therefore help a homeless problem if there is one in a city. Homelessness doesn't just afflict anyone, but a particular type of person. Enormously more afflicted by mental disorders, brain injuries, physical disabilities, intellectual retardation, drug addictions and associated health problems, and usually without strong social ties, at least 3/4 being single. These people are generally incapable of managing their lives on their own, and their lack of stable housing is just another aspect in a broader syndrome. While housing policy is thus relevant to some extent to at least solve the visible consequences of the problem, I think housing policy and the unhoused are more related in terminology than in substance. In any case, some terminology you will hear is about the so-called continuum of care and housing first approaches. The former is about moving individuals through a series of conditional stages, shelter, transitional housing, and so forth, with treatment of psychiatric and addiction disorders along the way. Treatment first, housing second. Housing first is about moving people into some intended to be permanent, affordable housing situation as quickly as reasonably possible and not conditional on treatment. Theoretically, you could make the case for either one, I think, but in empirical reality, in terms of days spent in stable housing, the housing first approach apparently clearly outperforms the continuum of care approach. It does no better, but apparently also no worse in terms of mental health. Once you know the result, you could come up with explanations why it obviously must be correct, but would you have been clearly committed to one side or the other before you knew? The result does comport with my intuition that a lot of these problems are simply inherent to the people afflicted. You can't wait to treat these people into being healthy and then give them shelter, because they will never truly be healthy. The continuum of care approach may reflect the idea of tackling root causes, and certainly, whatever is going on in these people's minds is the root cause of their problems. But that does not mean you can do anything about it. The best we can do may simply be to treat the symptoms of lying in the street and injecting polluted drugs with dirty needles. But maybe I would have had a different intuition if the other result obtained. This part was about the economic logic of possible government actions in the housing market, mostly sidestepping the legal and institutional details of what the US government actually does. That's what part 2 will be about. A rough overview of the specific housing programs, including zoning. That's going to be a little frustrating because most of that is not good policy. Part 1 should have made that credible, since there is no reason to assume government intervention in the housing market should often or systematically lead to better outcomes.